The day I forgave my father, he had already been gone for 40 years, and I still remember the taste of coffee in my mouth when it happened. My name is Harold, and I'm 81 years old. I have carried one unfinished conversation since I was a young man, and for a long time I believed time would hand it back to me when I was ready. I grew up in a small house that always felt a little too tidy, like someone was afraid of leaving fingerprints on their own life. My father believed love was proven by what you provided, not by what you said, and he provided in steady, quiet ways. The roof never leaked. The bills were paid. He worked long shifts at the mill, the kind of job that left his shoulders tight and his hands smelling like metal. At night he sat with the newspaper spread wide, and the house learned to breathe quietly around him. But warmth was scarce. My father spoke in instructions and corrections. He did not raise his voice much, and that might have been the hardest part, because when he was disappointed he did not shout, he simply went still. My mother tried to keep the peace, translating his silence into something softer. When I was a boy, I wanted what most boys want. I wanted my father to look at me with pride that had no conditions. I wanted him to ask questions that did not feel like inspections. He never hit me. I say that plainly because people sometimes imagine a hard father must be a violent one. Mine was just absent in the ways that do not leave bruises. If I reached for him, he offered a task. If I wanted comfort, he offered advice. If I wanted his presence, he offered a plan. One moment still sits in my mind like it is framed behind glass. I'm 12, standing in the doorway of the garage, holding a model airplane I built with shaky hands and stubborn patience. I had saved my allowance for weeks to buy it. My father was at his workbench, fingers stained with grease, tightening a bolt on a lawnmower engine. I stood there until he noticed me. When he finally looked up, I lifted the airplane and said, "I made it." He glanced at it for 2 seconds. Then he pointed at one wing and said, "That edge is rough. Sand it again. It'll fly better." No smile, no pause, just a correction, like love could only enter the room through the door of improvement. I nodded as if I had heard a compliment, because boys learn early how to survive without one. After that, I got good at collecting proof, grades, awards, neat handwriting, anything that looked like merit. I did it because I thought if I stacked enough evidence on the table, my father would have to look at it and finally say the words I had been waiting for. He never did. When I brought home a report card, he found the 1B. When I won a race, he asked why I did not win by more. When I earned a scholarship, he said, "Good, now you can afford college. Don't waste it." Even so, I loved him. I followed him around the house, asking if he needed help, offering to carry things that were not heavy, hopping for a moment where his hand would land on my shoulder and stay there. The first time I saw my father cry was not at a funeral. It was over a broken pocket watch. He came home late from work and went straight to the kitchen table, where he kept a small wooden box. He opened it carefully and took out a silver watch with a cracked face. He stared at it for a long time. My mother set down a plate of food without speaking. I watched from the hallway as my father ran his thumb over the broken glass like he was trying to smooth it back into time. A tear slid down his cheek and he wiped it away fast, almost angry at his own face. In that moment, I learned something that stayed with me. My father had feelings. He just did not know how to offer them to living people. When I turned 18, I thought leaving home would fix the ache. I told myself distance would make his silence feel smaller, that if I built my own life I would no longer need his approval. My mother hugged me like she was trying to memorize the shape of me. My father stood by the door and said, "Call your mother. Don't do anything foolish." I waited for more. I waited for him to say he would miss me. He did not. I drove away anyway, and in my mind I recorded it as proof that he did not care. Looking back, I can see it was proof he did not know how to say it. College was a new world where people spoke freely. I made friends who asked how you were doing and meant it. I learned what it felt like to be listened to without being corrected. And every time I came home, I shrank back into the old version of myself. My father would ask about classes like he was checking the oil in a car. If I spoke about fears, he offered solutions that felt like dismissals. The longer it went on, the more my disappointment hardened into anger. By my early 20s, I was carrying two things at once: a hunger for his love and a growing certainty that I would never get it. Those two things do not sit quietly together. They rub against each other until something sparks. The spark came on an ordinary winter evening when I came home for a weekend, and my father decided, once again, to tell me who I should be. That night the wind was pushing snow against the windows hard enough to sound like someone tossing handfuls of sand. My mother was asleep upstairs, tired from a week of smoothing over little tensions that never fully left our house. My father and I were in the living room, the television on but muted, the blue light flickering across his face while he sat in his chair with his arms folded like a locked gate. I had just told him I was thinking about changing my major. I had started in engineering because it felt like the kind of thing he could respect, something practical, something that sounded sturdy when you said it out loud. But I was taking a class in history, and for the first time I felt awake in a way I had never felt when I was drawing blueprints and doing calculations. I wanted to teach. I wanted to write. I wanted to build something made of words instead of metal. He did not ask why. He did not ask what I loved about it. He simply shook his head once, slow and final, and said, "That's not a real plan." I remember the way my stomach tightened, because it was the same feeling as being 12 again with that model airplane in my hands. I tried to stay calm. I told him I had thought about it, that I was doing well, that I would still finish school and find work. He leaned forward slightly and said, "Work is not a hobby. A man provides. You don't gamble your life on ideas." There was nothing cruel in his voice. That was the problem. It sounded like certainty, like a fact of nature. I told him I wasn't gambling. He told me I was being naive. I told him he never listened. He told me listening had nothing to do with it. Then he said something that felt like a hand closing around my throat. He said, "You want people to clap for you. You want attention, that's what this is." Something in me broke loose. Years of trying, years of proving, years of sandpaper and report cards and polite nodding, all of it rose up like a wave. I stood up so fast the coffee table rattled. I said, "You don't know me." He looked at me then, truly looked, and for a moment I thought I might finally see something softer in his eyes. But his face stayed tight, like he was holding something back with both hands. I said, "You've never known me. You've been in the same house, but you've never been with us." His jaw clenched. He said, "Don't speak about things you don't understand." I said, "Then help me understand. Just once. Tell me why it is always like this. Tell me why you can't just say you're proud of me." The room went quiet in a way that felt dangerous. My father stared at the blank television, and I watched the side of his face, waiting for an answer I had wanted since I could speak. He did not say he was proud. He did not say he loved me. He said, "Pride makes boys weak." I laughed, but it was not a happy sound. I said, "So you'd rather I go through life starving than risk being weak?" That's when he finally raised his voice, just a little, like someone lifting a heavy object off the floor. He said, "You think you're starving. You have no idea what starving is." And there it was, that line so many fathers of his generation carried like a shield. You have no idea. I wanted to shout back that he had no idea what it was like to be lonely in your own home, but I could already feel the argument turning into something we could never pull back from. I said something I regret to this day. I said, "Maybe you're the weak one. maybe you've been afraid your whole life." I watched the words land. His face changed, not into anger exactly, but into hurt that he did not know how to show. He stood up slowly, and for a moment I thought he might reach for me, not to strike me, but to stop me from leaving, to pull me back into some kind of peace. Instead he said, "If you want to live like that, then do it, but don't come back here asking for help." I should have stayed. I should have taken a breath and asked him what he meant by starving. I should have asked him about his childhood, about his fears, about the things he kept locked up behind that quiet face. I should have remembered the pocket watch and the tear on his cheek. But I was young, and I was tired of feeling small. I grabbed my coat, walked to the door, and left without waking my mother. On the drive back to campus, I kept rehearsing what I would say next time. I told myself we would cool down, we would talk like adults, we would find our way back to each other. But weeks passed, then months. He did not call. I did not call. My mother called, of course. She called with ordinary updates first, then with gentle suggestions. "Your father doesn't mean what he says," she told me. "He's just worried." She asked me to come home for my birthday. I said I was busy. She asked me to come for the holidays. I said I couldn't. I could have, but I couldn't bear walking back into that living room and pretending nothing happened. The strangest thing about pride is how it disguises itself as self-respect. For years I told myself I was protecting my future, protecting my heart, refusing to be diminished. I told myself I was finally choosing myself. I finished college and became a teacher. I married a woman named Ellen who had a voice like warm tea, gentle but clear. She saw right through my armor. On our third date, she asked me about my father, and I tried to shrug it off, but my eyes betrayed me. I told her the truth as simply as I could. He and I don't talk much. Ellen did not push. She just took my hand and said, "Sometimes people do what they were taught. That doesn't make it right, but it might explain it." I nodded like I agreed, but inside I still wanted to be angry. A few years later, Ellen and I had our first child, a boy. The first time I held him, something in me softened in a way I was not prepared for. He was so small, so trusting, and I felt a fierce tenderness that almost frightened me. I looked at his tiny face and I made myself a promise I thought I could keep easily. I would never let him wonder if he was loved. My mother sent a card when our son was born. My father's name was signed at the bottom in his careful handwriting, but there was no note from him, no message, nothing beyond the stiff formality of a signature. I stared at it longer than I should have. Ellen asked if I wanted to call them. I said, "Not yet." When our son was 2, my mother called and told me my father had been in the hospital. Nothing dramatic, she said, just tests, a scare, a warning from the doctor. She said, "He's getting older, Harold, you know that." I felt something tighten in my chest, but my pride was still sitting in the driver's seat. I said, "I'm glad he's all right." I asked how my mother was doing. I did not ask to speak to him. A week later, a letter arrived, addressed in my father's handwriting. I stared at it on the kitchen table as if it might bite. Ellen stood behind me and rested her hand on my shoulder. She did not tell me what to do. She just stayed there. I opened it. Inside was one sheet of paper with a few lines. It said, "Your mother says I should write. I don't know what to say. I was hard on you. I thought it would make you strong. I see now you are strong without my help. I hope you're doing well. Tell the boy I said hello." That was all. No apology in the way I wanted, no language of tenderness, no confession. Just a man standing at the edge of himself, offering what he could manage. I read it twice. Then I folded it back into the envelope and put it in a drawer. I told myself I would answer when I had the right words. I never wrote back. 2 months later, my mother called in the middle of a school day. I could hear something different in her breathing before she even spoke, like the air itself had changed. She said, "It happened this morning. He didn't wake up." I sat down on a student's desk, my knees suddenly unreliable. I asked what happened, even though I knew it did not matter. She said it was his heart, quick and quiet like him. After I hung up, I stared at the classroom walls covered in children's drawings and felt the strangest emptiness. Not just grief, but a hollow shock that the door had closed and I had not walked through it. At the funeral, I stood beside my mother and people came up to me to say kind things about my father. They talked about his work ethic, his reliability, his steady hands. They talked about favors he did without asking for anything back. I listened and tried to fit their stories into the father I knew. When they lowered the casket, I did not cry right away. I felt frozen, as if tears would make it too real. But later, alone in my childhood bedroom, I opened the drawer where I had tucked his letter, the one I never answered, and I pressed it to my chest like it could turn back time if I held it tightly enough. That night I realized something I had never allowed myself to say out loud. I wasn't only angry at my father. I was also afraid that if I forgave him, I would finally have to admit how much I missed him. For the first few years after my father died, I told myself I was fine. I went back to teaching. I changed diapers, paid bills, kissed Ellen goodnight, and acted like the past was something I had already put away. But grief does not always arrive as sadness. Sometimes it arrives as irritation, as a coldness you cannot explain. I would hear my own voice get sharp over small things, and afterward I would sit alone in the garage and wonder whose voice I had just borrowed. When my son was 10, he came home with a drawing he had made at school. It was our family stick figures with big smiles, and he had drawn my hand resting on his shoulder. I looked at it and felt something catch in my throat. I had never imagined my father that way. That night I went to the drawer where I kept my father's letter. I read it again, slower this time. The words that used to offend me now sounded like a man trying to reach across his own limitations. I could almost see him at the kitchen table, pen in hand, staring at the paper like it was a test he was about to fail. Years passed. My mother grew older and smaller, and I visited more often. We would sit in her kitchen and talk about ordinary things, and sometimes she would mention my father as if he were still out back splitting wood. One afternoon when I was 56, my mother handed me a small wooden box. "This was his," she said. "I think you should have it." Inside was the pocket watch I had seen him cry over. The cracked glass was still there. The hands were frozen at 3:17. I asked her what it meant. She told me it had belonged to his father, a man I never met, a man who died when my father was 16. "Your grandfather worked himself to death," she said. "Your father took that watch to the funeral, and he said it stopped at the moment they closed the casket." I held it in my palm and felt a tenderness I did not expect, not just for the boy I had been, but for the boy my father had been. I realized I had never asked what his childhood was like. I had never asked what he lost, what he feared, what he promised himself he would never become. Then, on an ordinary morning when I was 61, I was making coffee before sunrise. The house was quiet. Ellen was asleep. The kettle clicked and hummed. I stood at the counter and looked at my hands, older now, with the same blunt knuckles my father had. I felt a sudden exhaustion, the kind that comes from carrying something heavy for too long. I took the pocket watch out of its box and set it on the table. I placed my father's letter beside it. And then I did something I had not done in 40 years. I spoke to him. Not in a dramatic way, not with anger, just with the plain voice of a man who finally ran out of defenses. I said, "I'm sorry I never wrote back." The words surprised me. I had spent decades building a case against him, but in that moment I could see my own part clearly. I could see the way I chose silence because silence felt powerful. I said I wanted you to be different. I wanted you to say the words. I wanted you to know me, but I never tried to know you. I waited for some grand release, but what came was smaller and truer. I felt grief, yes, but I also felt understanding. I could picture my father as a young man at his own father's grave, holding that watch and deciding that love meant survival, that tenderness was a risk. I could picture him coming home from the mill with his shoulders burning, looking at his children and feeling terrified of failing them. In that quiet kitchen, I forgave him. Not because the past changed, and not because what he did was harmless, but because I finally saw him as a whole person instead of a verdict. I said one last thing, and it came out like a confession. I said, I love you, I always did. When I finished, I expected to feel empty, but I did not. I felt lighter, the way you feel after setting down a suitcase you forgot you were carrying. That forgiveness did not erase the years we lost. It did not give my father a chance to hold his grandson or hear about my life in my own words. The day I forgave him still came 40 years too late. But it changed what came after. I stopped flinching when my son disagreed with me. I stopped treating love like a reward that had to be earned. When my grandson was born, I held him and told him, quietly and plainly, that I was glad he was here. If you are listening to me and there is someone you have not called, someone you are still punishing with your silence, I will not tell you it is easy. You do not have to excuse what hurt you. You do not have to pretend it did not matter. But if there is any part of you waiting for the perfect moment, remember that time does not negotiate. It keeps moving, whether you are ready or not. Write the letter, make the call, ask the question you have avoided, and if the person is already gone, speak anyway. Say what is true, even if it comes out simple and clumsy at first. I forgave my father in a quiet kitchen with a cup of coffee and a broken watch. I wish I had done it when his hands were still warm. I cannot change that, but maybe you can.